Well, hello and blessings to all. For those of you who have been with us the past several weeks, my name is Tim Gold, Minister of Education Administration at First Baptist Pell City, and welcome to this week's online lesson. Today we're in the Explore the Bible curriculum series, and we're continuing to look at the Song of Songs or Proverbs. And today's lesson we're going to be looking at chapter 5 of Proverbs. This week is entitled Following God's Design. Well, some first thoughts as we look at the lesson today. We expect builders to follow blueprints, and failing to do so leads to problems down the road. Well, the same holds true when it comes to sex. Might not be as a shock to you, but that's what God says. And He's created humans as men and women with two different genders. Sex was part of His creative plan. Failing to follow His design for sex only leads to problems down the road, and Solomon's addressed the traps awaiting those who ignore God's design and the blessings awaiting those who follow God's design. Some questions to consider as we begin our lesson today. What if you ignored the blueprint and just followed your heart as you built a house? How would your decision affect the construction process? A couple of good questions to think of. All right, let's dive into the context currently. All right, this passage focuses on God's wisdom regarding appropriate sexual behavior. Other topics come into view along the way, driving home the necessity of trusting God for His wisdom and applying it to the circumstances of life. Solomon began this portion of Proverbs by urging his son to pay attention to his warning about sexual immorality. Although Solomon focused his attention on adultery, the instruction covers the wide range of sexual sins and that tempt believers to ignore God's design and make foolish choices. The temptation to turn away from his path would begin with flattering compliments offered to a young man by an immoral woman. If he gave in to the temptation, he would be faced with miserable outcomes that would make him regret his choice. If he devoted himself to his wife exclusively, however, he would enjoy the fulfillment of sexual intimacy God intended. You see that in Proverbs 5, verses 1 through 23. From there, Solomon taught his son about the value of making wise financial decisions. Solomon also encouraged his son to develop a healthy work ethic, and to stay away from scoundrels who exhibited nasty behavior. He then presented his son with 7 sinful behaviors that God hates. You see that in chapter 6, verses 1 through 19. Once again, Solomon returned to the need for his son to avoid sexual sin. This time, Solomon included his wife in his instruction. They challenged their son to run away from the temptation of adultery. They told of the consequences he would expect if he gave in to immorality. Solomon related a story about a young man who had been seduced by an immoral woman. In the story, the young man was naive about lust and allowed himself to be seduced. Solomon directed his son to see that the young man in the story chose a foolish path that led him to misery and suffering. The ultimate suffering came forth in the form of death. See that in chapter 6, verses 20 through chapter 7, verses 27. Well, let's get into the text of our passage this week. Proverbs chapter 5, verses 3 through 6. For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps follow the path to Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways wander, and she does not know it. Well, in verse 2 of this chapter, Solomon urged his son to use his lips to pass along godly instruction. By using his lips in that way, he would preserve wisdom for future generations. In verse 3, Solomon told his son about what would come from the lips of a forbidden woman. This would have been a woman who wanted to lure a young man into a web of immorality, kind of like a black widow spins a web for its next meal. She was someone other than the young man's wife. She used her lips as the words that passed through them as tools of seduction. Now, in ancient Israel, nothing could have been sweeter than honey. Likewise, nothing could have been compared with her sweet, seductive speech. In Solomon's day, nothing could have been smoother than olive oil. It flowed smoothly out of its container. So did the flattering words of a woman who wanted to use them to seduce someone. Her flattery would make her quite difficult for a young man to resist. Paying attention to the lips of the adulteress and listening to her words would prove to be dangerous. At the beginning, her seductive speech would be most beguiling with the promise of carnal pleasure. However, in the end, the story would be actually quite different, sadly. In fact, it would be dreadful. Although her words might have conveyed the promise of a sweet experience, they only covered up the harsh reality about living for physical pleasure. It would turn out to be a terrible choice. In the end, sexual encounter with a forbidden woman would have horrible consequences, and she would reveal her true identity. While her words may have been sweet and smooth, bitterness actually emanated from her. Wormwood, that was a shrub that had a bitter flavor. Solomon also described her as a two-edged sword that would be sharp enough to slash a person into pieces. Her flattery would build up the ego of an unsuspecting young man at the start, but eventually would leave him in shreds. He would be left with nothing but extreme bitterness and awful misery. That's not the worst part of the story. The path the promiscuous woman had chosen leads to death. For Solomon, life's a journey, and being wise demands we pay close attention to each step we take in it and on it. When people take the path of satisfying sexual urges without restraint, they place their feet on the road that leads to Sheol. In other words, the grave is what awaits them. They don't experience any lasting gratification by stepping on the foolish paths of sexual immorality. Well, God's plan for marriage involves one man, one woman who devote themselves to each other for life. The path a married couple takes together proves to be rewarding because they come to understand that sexual intimacy with only each other renders true and lasting fulfillment. It's one of the life-enriching blessings that come with living out God's wisdom in marriage. As Solomon continued to warn his son, he took a closer look at the forbidden woman herself. He described her as a person who had rejected God's wisdom. As a result, she took no thought about the disaster she would make of her life. She never gave a moment's consideration to the destination of the path she had chosen for herself. Obviously, she didn't have true compassion for the person she tried to seduce. She pretended to show compassion for him so she could lure him closer to her and get him within her reach. But sadly, she showed that she didn't care about herself either. Question to consider at this time. What warnings about charming but empty flattery has Solomon instruction provided for you and for us, all of us? Good question to consider. All right, verses 7 and 8 of our text. And now, O sons, listen to me, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house. The word now that Solomon issued a warning about the immoral woman, he urged his sons to pay close attention to what he had to say next. The reference to his sons obviously included other young men in his royal court, but it also includes God's people everywhere. Solomon's appeal would be valuable for everyone in generations to come who would give themselves to seeking godly wisdom. This is why Solomon's words about the consequences of immorality deserve our attention today. They provide Christians with God's wisdom for making the right choices about fidelity to Him and to one another in marriage. Solomon described for believers the fate of anyone who chooses to give in to sexual sin. We do well to not depart from his warning. When we ignore God's wisdom, we take the first foolish step towards misery and regret. Repeating what he said earlier, Solomon instructed his sons to keep his distance from the forbidden woman who would take him down the path of sexual temptation. He mentioned her in a way that identified her either as an adulteress, a mistress, or a prostitute. She could also have been a woman from a foreign land. See that in verse 10. Her tempting ways would pull a man away from his commitment to the Lord. Tempting him with the possibility of easy sexual gratification would make letting go of his devotion to his wife that much easier. Her infidelity would make him lose sight of the priority of honoring the Lord with a life that valued that's God's wisdom. For that reason, Solomon gave the order to stay away from her door. Don't even go near it. The best way to keep from giving in to temptation would be to avoid even the slightest possibility of coming into contact with it. Good sentence to remember. Verses 9 through 11. Lest you give your honor to others and your years to the merciless, lest strangers take their fill of your strength, and your labors go to the house of a foreigner, and at the end of your life you groan when your flesh and body are consumed. Well, what would happen to a person who chose to do otherwise? Solomon's answer to that question leaves us with a grim warning that deserves to be taken very seriously. Giving in to sexual immorality places a person in danger of losing respect, honor, and dignity. Well, who are the others who rob us of our honor? Well, they may be the other lovers of the forbidden woman, owners of a prostitute, or the husband of an unfaithful wife. They're described as merciless, and their relationship with the promiscuous woman takes a toll on anyone who has a sexual encounter with her. Financial hardships awaited the unsuspecting victim on the other side of an illicit sexual encounter. Again, strangers could have been relatives or owners of a foreign woman who made her way into Israel and seduced men away from the Lord. Or they could have been the woman's other sexual partners. The man driven by lust for her may not have known them until after she had seduced him. Perhaps they would blackmail him, or maybe they would require him to support her financially. No matter how it happened, his strength or wealth would be taken away from him and given to them. Instead of living with financial security, his resources would have been provided for him. He would be destitute while someone else enjoyed his money. His heart would break as he watched his wealth get reallocated to the house of a foreigner. The scheme shifts from finances to a deathbed. Time has passed since lust made a young man turn his back on God's wisdom and give himself to sexual immorality. The person who had been caught up in the illicit affair with the forbidden woman has to come to the end of his life. Behind him, he could see the footprints of the steps he had taken on his way to a sexual encounter he would regret one day. Now that day had come. There he lies on his bed, dying by degrees and groaning with deep lament over what has happened to his body. The effects of his immorality have consumed his body. However, the physical pain brought on by disease could not compare to the anguish and humiliation he had to endure because he had made a foolish choice. You see that in chapter 5, verses 12 through 14. All right, questions to consider at this time. When do people caught up in sexual sin usually come to see that they have been foolish? How can we warn others about the disturbing consequence of sexual immorality? All right, what the Bible says about sexual sin. Here are some little tick points you can take note of. Number 1, sexual sin begins in the mind. That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. Number 2, sexual temptation, it is powerful. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18. 3, sexual sin is destructive. Proverbs 6, verses 32. And fourthly, forgiveness, yes, is available if you have sinned. John chapter 8, verses 10 through 11, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11. That's some points about what the Bible says about sexual sin. All right, verse 15. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Well, with the skilled use of word pictures, Solomon affirmed the unique promise of sexual intimacy in marriage. He used water to make the affirmation, and he probably could not have made a better choice. See, in Solomon's day, water was a precious treasure, a precious commodity. The desert climate didn't produce much water. Also, the climate created a serious need for it. Water gave life, and without it, nothing could survive. People drank water to stay alive. By the same token, the health and survival of a marriage relationship depends on being faithful to one another. That's what Solomon had in mind when he mentioned the cistern, C-I-S-T-E-R-N. Wise people back then collected rainwater in a cistern, making it available for a long time to come. A cistern served Solomon well as a word picture that described a wife. He affirmed the wisdom of a husband who devoted himself to a sexual relationship with no one other than his own wife. Verses 16 and 17. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be for yourself alone, and not for strangers with you. Well, continue to use the word picture of water, Solomon raised an important question about sexual fidelity in marriage. Why would a husband want to become sexually involved with someone other than his wife? Of course, the same question could be asked about a wife. Why did she want to have sexual relationships with someone who wasn't her husband? That's the question Solomon asked when inquired about springs. He wondered how wise a person would be if he took the precious water he had collected for himself and poured it into the street. From the perspective of a wise person, such an action would be considered foolish. What sense would it make to go to the public square and pour out life-giving water onto the ground? God made his commandment about adultery perfectly clear. You see that in Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. Adultery is a sin, and God prohibited his people from engaging in it. He also spoke through his prophets to tell his people about the consequences of the sin of adultery. See that in Jeremiah chapter 13, verse 27. Solomon underscored another reason God's people should not engage in sexual immorality. It's a foolish choice. It's as foolish as wasting life-sustaining water by pouring it into the street. Verse 17 answers the question Solomon asked in verse 16. In the process of answering the question, he directed the attention of God's people to a harsh reality about adultery and other expressions of sexual immorality. God intended the relationship between a husband and his wife to be marked by fidelity to one another. Him for her and her for him. In that kind of relationship, intimacy would grow as the couple devoted themselves solely to each other. The blessing of intimacy would disappear when adultery entered the relationship. No longer would the couple enjoy the unique blessing that would result from giving themselves to each other exclusively. Instead, they would have to reckon with the presence of strangers in their marriage. The strangers were the other sexual partners who would have intruded into a married couple's relationship. Solomon didn't provide us with their exact identity. Whoever they were, however, they had one trait in common. They had been sexually involved with other people as well. In turn, these strangers now shared in the adultery and had compromised the intimacy that a married couple was meant to enjoy. Verse 18, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. After vividly describing the path of adultery, Solomon directed God's people to the appropriate way to live according to God's design. His direction came in the form of a blessing to husbands, but also applied to wives as well. Once more, he used the word picture of water by mentioning a fountain. Of course, water flowed freely from a fountain, and the stream that fed it could be counted on to provide never-ending supply of water. In the same way, sexual intimacy in marriage renders a blessing from a husband and wife that would be the source of endless joy for them as they share life together. When we ponder the blessing of the marriage that Solomon brings to mind, we often think about our children. We can agree that children are one of God's blessings to a marriage. However, God blesses a marriage in other ways too. Newlyweds cannot begin to imagine the blessings that are in store for them as they share life together across the years to come. For that reason, couples do well to keep God's design for them in mind and look forward to the pleasure of being together until death separates them. Final question to consider. Who are your role models for marriage, and why? Well, the key doctrine they want us to understand now is the doctrine of family. It simply says this: marriage is God's unique gift to reveal the union between Christ and His church and to provide for the man and the woman in marriage the framework for intimate companionship, the channel of sexual expression according to the biblical standards, and the means for procreation of the human race. Seen in Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 through 24. Very probing lesson today. Well, as we progress through the study in Proverbs, I pray you're continuing to meet the challenge that was offered to you in the weeks previous. For the next couple of months, read at least a chapter a day in Proverbs and repeat it each month. Actually, today is July 1st, so you got a good time to start off reading Proverbs. See what God does in your life. I pray you're doing that. I encourage you to stay consistent in the reading. In times like these we currently live in, we need as much wisdom from God as we can get. Please join us next week as we'll continue to look at chapters 6 and 8 of Proverbs in this summer study. God bless you. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you again for this time, this day. Thank you again for the lesson you've given us through your word, through Solomon and his wisdom that you gave him about fidelity of marriage. I pray that we would cling to that fiercely, and God, seek your will in our relationships with our spouses, and cling to him or her as God you've instructed in your word. Thank you again for your instruction, and we love you. In your name I pray. Amen. Good to be with you this week. Look forward to seeing you next week in next week's lesson. God bless.